Maricopa County medical examiner has ruled that 31-year-old Angela Tramonte's death was an accident. She died of heat exposure, but Tramonte's mother says she's furious and frustrated. She believes that the off-duty officer that her daughter was hiking with, Dario Dizdar, should bear some responsibility in what happened to her. The pair started off the hike together, and Angela was found dead after they had separated.
And she thought because he was a police officer, she was safe, and she wasn't.
31-year-old Angela Tramonte's mother is furious, and she believes Phoenix police need to further investigate Angela's death. Angela's mother says she spoke with a Phoenix police officer soon after and gave the officer the location of her daughter's phone.
I sent him the address where it was. It took them 3 hours to find her. And when I talked to Dario that night and asked him, when was the last time you saw my daughter? He said 6 hours ago. So nonchalant.
By the time Angela was found in the backyard of a home, she'd already passed. Police say there's no evidence of foul play. The medical examiner has ruled the death accidental. Another hiker who crossed paths with the pair took this photo and happened to capture the two. He spoke briefly with Dario that day.
Dario did Angela a disservice that day by separating from her. And he really is not facing any kind of repercussions.
Phoenix police released a statement saying the department did an extensive investigation and that all the evidence points to this being a tragic accident.
The police may not be investigating this, but I won't stop. I will not stop. There is something missing that I, as a mother, cannot put my finger on.
Now, neither Dizdar nor Tramonte had any water with them when they were hiking on Camelback Mountain.
Cameras watched Dizdar walk into police headquarters, but that's not the end of what happened. But before we tell you more, here's some important new details about Angela Tramonte and what happened the day she died. ABC 15 obtained this official incident report from a Phoenix Park ranger. It gives specific details about how rescuers finally found Tramonte after hours of searching. Quote, Fire was in contact with Phoenix police and had them ping her phone. When that wasn't enough, Fire was able to have a friend of Angela use an iPhone application to get a more accurate ping. By narrowing down the area, PD units went door to door, knocking in the neighborhood. Angela's body was found in the backyard of this home on the side of Camelback Mountain. And while the park ranger's report clears up how she was found, it also raises more questions. The most obvious, if her phone was on, why didn't she call for help? But it also raises concerns about the evolving story we're getting from police and fire officials. Here's what Fire first said at the scene about this officer.
He's been living here for a while, he said, and he's very familiar with this mountain. Says he hikes it at this time of day all the time, from the top to the bottom.
Then this week, fire officials called our newsroom and asked us to stop using that soundbite because they misunderstood Dizdar. They claimed he hadn't hiked Camelback in years. He got lost himself on the way down and had to Uber back to the parking lot. But in the park ranger's incident report, it states Dizdar told the ranger, quote, he was local and did this hike all of the time. And remember, the officials say neither Dizdar nor Tramonte brought any water.
Halfway up, she becomes overheated, wants to turn around. He tells her to turn around, go back down to the parking lot. He continues up to the peak, makes his way up to the top, comes all the way back down to the parking lot. She's not here.
Tramonte was from the Boston area. She flew in to meet Dizdar for the first time. The two had been chatting online. So there's a lot more our news crew wanted to ask Dizdar when he came back out of PD headquarters. Instead, Phoenix Public Information officers came out with his keys and moved his car. A spokesperson told our reporter it's because they didn't want anyone to recognize his vehicle. I'm investigator Dave Biscobing, ABC 15, Arizona.
We reached out to Phoenix PD with questions about this story. They responded late this afternoon.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
Include information about a police officer's credibility.
And certainly if the officer, the arresting officer, is one of the key witnesses, then if there's some question as to whether, that officer has a history of perjury or misconduct, the defense is going to want that information.
Under Arizona Revised Statutes 13-1201, it's not a long statute at all. You can look it up, and this is really what the language says. It says that you can be charged or convicted of endangerment if you recklessly endanger another person with a substantial risk of imminent death or physical injury. That's really about it. So you can see, what does a lot of that mean? What does recklessly endangering somebody mean? How can we define that? So if we look to a different part of the statutes, if we look over to 13-105 in the definitions portion of the ARS, it actually defines recklessness. What is reckless? So we'll take this word out, we'll look to a different statute, and we'll get some guidance there. So reckless, to act recklessly, it means that somebody is doing something that consciously disregards a substantial and unjustifiable risk that the outcome will occur. So if you know that something will happen, or you're somewhat certain that an outcome is going to happen, and you disregard that risk, that's going to be considered recklessness. What we're doing is we're looking at what's called a gross deviation from the standard of conduct that a reasonable person would otherwise do. So let's say, for example, there's a dangerous situation. A reasonable person would do something about that situation, but the individual in this case just doesn't follow that type of conduct. So they disregard a substantial risk. Their conduct is a gross deviation. It's abnormal. It's something that is not a little bit unusual. It's grossly abnormal. It's a big difference from what a reasonable person would do, and that's going to constitute recklessness. It's also important to note, and we see this in alcohol and drug cases, that voluntary intoxication, so being under the influence of some altering substance, if you still engage in some conduct that is going to be a gross deviation from the standard of care, the standard of conduct, that's going to also be reckless. So just because you're under the influence of alcohol or some other substance doesn't mean that it's going to alleviate or relieve you of any recklessness. So being intoxicated can still be reckless. So that's how you define recklessness. So then you have to plug that back into this statute. So what is somebody doing? Does that meet the recklessness portion of this? Is it a gross standard of conduct deviation from the normal standard of care, or is it something that maybe a reasonable person would have done that under the circumstances? That's a big defense in all endangerment charges. You want to make sure that you can argue that the conduct in question here was not actually reckless. If you look at the statute, you look at the definitions, you can make a good argument that a reasonable person may have done that, or they may not have known about the risk, or they may not have considered the risk, and therefore a reasonable person wouldn't have acted any differently. So that's how the statute looks. The penalties, they can be pretty severe. So if it is a type of conduct that would put somebody in a substantial risk of imminent death, so if it's something that it could cause somebody to almost die, whether they almost died or not, if it put them in a position where it was close or likely, like an example would be if somebody's racing their car at 130 miles an hour. They may not have gotten in an accident, but if they did get in an accident, their passenger who was not wearing their seatbelt may have flown out the window or been killed. So that may be something that would be a gross standard, a gross deviation from the normal standard of conduct. Most people don't go 130 miles an hour. So if somebody was doing that, the officers could potentially argue that that conduct would have placed somebody in a potential for a substantial risk of imminent death or physical injury. If you're going to say it's death, the penalty for that is going to be a Class 6 felony. So as a reminder, felonies are more serious than misdemeanors, and we have different levels of felonies. So Class 6 is the lowest level of a felony, but it's still a felony. Felony convictions are very problematic. You lose your right to vote, lose your right to have a firearm, could potentially go to prison for those types of offenses, so they are a bit serious. If there's no risk of no substantial risk of imminent death, just physical injury, it drops it from a felony into a misdemeanor. And so anything that involves a substantial risk of injury is going to be a Class 1 misdemeanor, which is the highest level of misdemeanor that we have in Arizona. It's the same classification as a DUI, so it's serious. So this is how endangerment works.
We have 2 minutes on the terms medical examiner and coroner, and sometimes they are often misused or people think that they're interchangeable. So in our country, every state dictates whether they're going to have a medical examiner system or a coroner system, and some have this gray area version of both. So within the states, then sometimes they break down on each county determines what they're going to do inside of it. So medical examiners and coroners investigate deaths, and they investigate certain types of death. The first type is if somebody is not under a physician's care and they die of a disease or sometimes a natural cause that looks like maybe not a natural cause. They have to investigate why they showed up at the emergency room and died suddenly, or maybe why they died at home suddenly, and they have to determine then if there's foul play or if it was a disease that they need to be concerned about or if it was natural causes. They also investigate if there's an accident, a suicide, a homicide. So anything that looks abnormal or suspicious, the medical examiner and coroner or coroner are called in to investigate it and to look into it. So their report is going to house certain items. It's going to house a cause of death. It's going to house the autopsy and the drug analysis that is done for levels of anything that is in the person's system when they died, and will have a circumstances leading to the death, whether it's natural or whether it's homicide or whether it's suicide. They'll have all of that in the report then as well. So a medical examiner is a medical doctor that specializes most of the time in pathology as a pathologist, and they are the ones who do the autopsy on the person. They are appointed and hired by the state or the county to do that for all of the suspicious deaths within the county. And sometimes a medical examiner will cover multiple counties, or, you know, if it's a small state, there may be just one in a state, depending on the size of the state. So the coroner system has an elected official that the people elect. So this may be, in some states it's required that it's a medical doctor, but in others, anybody can be the coroner. So the farmer down the road, the person who owns the drugstore in town, stay-at-home mom from the community, anyone can be a coroner with no medical history. A lot of times a coroner system is in place because maybe it's a very rural area, and so you're 2 hours away from a large hospital, or your resources are very spread out, and so you don't have a medical examiner system, cannot set up a medical examiner system close to you because there's not enough resources to do so. If an autopsy is then deemed needed, the coroner will have the person sent to the medical examiner, sometimes several hours away, for the autopsy to be completed. So essentially, the coroner's job is declaring the person dead, identifying the person, gathering their effects and personal items, and then returning them to the next of kin and notifying the next of kin of that death. So you may go from one state to another, and it can be a different from a coroner system to a medical examiner system. And within those states, the coroner and medical examiner could have completely different powers, completely different rules, completely different laws that they have to follow. Even two coroner systems can look completely different. One good example, so like in Georgia, the coroner has the same power as the sheriff. And the coroner is the only person who can technically arrest the sheriff. So you get into some of the legal system components of a coroner as well as the medical and kind of death investigation part with a coroner. So what system is set up in your area? Let me know, investigate into it, look into it, see who rules in your area if there was going to be a death that occurred that was suspicious. You know, educate yourself, get to know about it. Other countries also have coroner systems and medical systems as well. So share with me what is in your area. 2 minutes on medical examiner and coroners. Bye guys.